Welcome to episode 5 of Hope Ropes, where we share hope stories of hope and healing and transformation. I invite you to just get comfortable, listen with an open heart, an open mind, and grab onto the hope ropes that you'll hear here. And we're just asking that you borrow belief from those who've gone before you until you can really hold it for yourself. And today I'm so excited because we have Jamie McCoy here. She is a licensed psychotherapist and trauma recovery coach. She's been practicing for 15 years. So she knows her stuff. And I love that she uses a holistic approach that incorporates the wisdom of the body through resources like somatic experiencing and embodied parts work. She is so passionate about empowering people like you and I, others, to master their stress physiology so they can shift from survival mode to living the full and resilient lives they're meant to experience. And many of you may know her from her account on Instagram at My Integrative Therapist, where she shares wisdom and brings much needed comedic relief to those of us on this journey of trauma recovery. So welcome, Jamie. It's an honor to
Thank
have you
you.
here. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so great to finally just connect. We were just talking about that, how Instagram is such an interesting place where you form these connections, but don't always actually get to speak to each other
Yeah.
outside. So it's just so great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it feels like it feels like we know each other to a certain degree because we've chatted a little bit, but it's so amazing to just meet virtually face to face and have a real conversation. And that's really what this is about. I know that you, Jamie, have had your own personal experience with chronic illness. Tell
Yeah.
us a little bit about your journey and what that was like for you.
Yeah. So, like so many people, for me, my journey did begin in childhood where I was never really a healthy child. I was hospitalized as a baby, had recurrent urinary tract infections, was constantly on antibiotics. But little did I know at the time, there are roots that connect with childhood trauma and having these kinds of chronic illnesses. But needless to say, I did go through many different challenges. And eventually, it wasn't until I got to college that I really started connecting the dots that, there may be something bigger to this picture.
Mm.
Um, I did hop around though for quite a while to different specialists, having different procedures, getting different diagnoses and labels, eventually getting the Lyme disease diagnosis, which I thought at the time was my answer for everything. And I was just like, oh, great. All of the random pains and things that have gone on in every single system of my body, this is it. And now I know why. And so I had watched the documentary called Under Our Skin at the time. And I thought, because many people in this documentary were doing long-term IV antibiotics for Lyme disease and seemed to have success. I was living in New York City at the time, and one of the doctors that was in the film lived by me. And so I actually went to him and I got a port surgically implanted in my chest. And I proceeded to do a year of just high doses of many different antibiotics for, it felt like forever, but honestly, the thing that I thought was my answer turned out to create a lot more complications. So that's sort of what opened my eyes to a more holistic perspective after that. But that's just,
Wow. Yeah, so
yeah.
that's quite a journey, right? Like I think for many of
Mhm.
us, once we get this label, we think, oh, it's over. We've found and we're obviously desperate to try everything and anything to heal. And
Yes.
I know you shared a little bit on your website and a little bit about your story about all of the things that you tried. And I wanted to kind of talk about, I mean, there are a lot of warning signs, when you're looking for somebody to support you through this journey, right? I mean, when we're so sick, feeling so unwell, I think we're just so desperate and
Yeah.
very easily manipulated or taken advantage of. And you have, I know we both have some stories about that, and I would like you to touch a little bit on that of what were some of the things that you tried or the people that you went to that yeah, made you kind of feel like you were being taken advantage of, or that really that alarm kind of went off like, ooh, is this like, are they really meaning to help me? What was your experience there?
Yeah. So like I said, by the time I was done with the antibiotics, it was actually came about because I was giving myself an infusion, and you're supposed to clear the IV line before you enter any drugs or anything into your system with an IV line. I forgot to clear the line, and a bunch of air actually went through the line, and I started having a heart attack. And I had this kind of surreal spiritual experience in that moment. And I was just like very clear, I'm no longer doing treatments that harm my body. I'm only going to do things that feel nourishing and supportive to my system. And I immediately, within a week, had that port removed. And I just started on this more of spiritual path where I was still bedridden, and I was watching a lot of YouTube videos and found different channels that talked about things like the law of attraction and just how we create our reality. And inherently, it's not like I think that there's anything wrong with understanding how our mind affects our body and how our thoughts affect our body. However, just some of the channels that I was watching, introduced me to different modalities and different energy workers. And like you said, not everyone has the best intentions in mind, especially when they're working with people with chronic illness who are desperate for healing. And I was really wanting something else so badly. I was like, if this isn't the answer, there's got to be something else. And, this person that I had found seemed to be able to help people with Lyme disease without even meeting with them. And at the time when I was studying all this about energy and the law of attraction, I really believed that there could be some kind of healing that took place just with our intentions and with connecting with someone like who seemed to be a gifted healer.
Mhm.
So I started working with this man, and part of me, I was getting better. I was also doing other things that were helpful to me. And like I said, I started learning more about trauma and my nervous system. So, at the time I was working with him, it seemed like this was working. And then it ended up being that I found out he was actually, just kind of a scammer. And after I said I didn't want to work with him anymore, he wanted to keep charging me. And so I just kind of went through this crisis of, oh my God, like, how did I fall into this and get involved with this quote unquote healer that just wanted to take my money? And what does this mean about the healing I thought I did in my body? And I became very disillusioned with all these new beliefs that I had taken on. And like, what does this all mean? And so, yeah, I actually landed in kind of just a crisis of faith, really, at that point in time. So, yeah, it's unfortunately learned the hard way that I had to be a little bit more discerning and trust myself first before handing that power over to someone else.
Yes. Oh, I can so relate, Jamie, because, and I think a lot of people can, right? Because for some of us too, we feel so ashamed of like, how did I even not see it then? Right.
Yeah.
But when we're in it, like we're just so desperate to feel better. And
Yeah.
I will also share that I jumped from healer to healer.
Mhm.
And I mean, everything from, and I'm not bashing any of these, but I was looking outside of myself so desperately for someone to fix me
Yeah.
and to save me. And I was such an easy target. I
Yeah.
remember getting hundreds of dollars away for for a simple phone call where they had to reconnect me. Like,
Mhm.
oh, your soul's disconnected. E-transfer me, $300-400 and I'll reconnect it. Oh, your husband's offline now. I'll reconnect it. And I was doing it. And yeah, there was some placebo effect to it because for a moment, I was like, oh wait, I think I'm starting to feel better.
Mhm.
And yet then it would be like, ooh, but there, this person and that you can't go around that person. So it's inadvertently created more and more fear,
Yeah.
more unsafety, right? And I had a crisis of faith as well, big time. I was like, what does all of this mean? I mean, I was so deep into it as well. Like I studied it. I became like a key master. Like I was again under this belief that healing was outside. It
Yep.
was someone else could bring it to me.
Mhm.
And so bring us to how I mean, you kind of tried the traditional, like the IV, all the treatment, antibiotics, you tried the spiritual. And so during this, you're starting to study trauma.
Yeah.
And yeah, so what happened at that point?
It's so interesting that I think so many of us go through this because as I learned about trauma and what it really means to be in survival, and when we're in this kind of, I would say people who have chronic illness are more in that chronic freeze response. For me, it was maybe a functional freeze where there was a period of time where I was working and kind of on autopilot before I totally crashed. But part of the stages of the trauma response is we go through a kind of automatic obedience will happen when we're in freeze. Because if you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, if somebody has a gun to your head, you're going to want to obey them so that you have your best chance at survival. And people, I don't think, realize this, especially when they're going to doctors. And we kind of give away our power to this authority because we're sort of in that freeze state. So our rational thinking isn't fully there. And we're just sort of automatically obeying. And it's sort of at the root of that people pleaser response that we can go
Wow.
through,
Yeah.
which is also a subset of freeze, right? So I think that that's where I was. And I started recognizing that. And I think for me, it was just, okay, I just have to like logically think I'm living in New York City at the time. I know that my body doesn't feel I'm rushing. This doesn't really resonate with me anymore. It's not conducive to healing. So I decided to move to California where I could get more sun.
Mm.
And I found another doctor, an integrative practitioner that I did work with, where I would just do just kind of like vitamin IVs and things like that. I was just nourishing and then foundations of just like, how do I just support my body? I'm not going to attack it and try and kill the bugs and just like kill, which is the mentality that I was coming from before. And I think once I got some of that energy back into my system, you kind of come out of the freeze. And so it's not just all the power of the mind and believing it. Sometimes you have to support some nutrients to your system so your mitochondria can function and you have physical energy to like move and thaw out of the freeze. And then your brain kind of fully functions again. And so get your rational skills and critical thinking comes back online. And that's sort of what
Yeah,
happened to me.
that makes total sense. And I mean, I love that this concept of obedience.
Yeah.
I've never heard it the way that you've explained it. And looking back, I can totally see that, right?
Yeah.
And wow, just how like you said, how many authority figures will tell you something, and it's like, yep, that's the truth, or I have to do this, I have to do that. And it
Yeah.
comes from that obedience. If I don't do this, something bad will happen. And there's that fear response as well. So wild. And I love that you said, because I say this all the time, is seeing all of these things as supports. How can I support this? How can I support my body as it does what it do? How can I support my nervous system? And that's how I see it. And I love that you said that is, yeah, it's never like a one, one line of healing. There's many pathways to safety, to recovery. But the idea of it, at least the way that I see it, is all of the things that we do outside of ourselves are meant to support. It's never the fix.
Yeah.
It's not to come at, like you said, like this wall that I'm attacking. It is that support, and a lot of the times support we didn't get for many
Exactly.
years. Yeah. So that's amazing. So started to come out of freeze, and see things, started to kind of come back online, and what happened from there? And yeah.
Yeah. So basically from there I had realized during that time where I call it I was in the new age dissociation. When I was in that time I was talking about or like believing all about this ego death. You had to kill your ego, whatever that meant, this part of you that was just this bad part of you. And I remember at that time I had all these journals from when I was a little girl until as an adult. At the time I think I was in my late 20s. I threw them all out and I was like, I have to get rid of this.
Mm.
These are all the parts of me that were the problem. And I remember like once I came out of that new age dissociation and I was thawing the freeze, I realized like, oh my goodness, actually that's not what it's about. What it's about is reclaiming and integrating these
Oh,
parts of you that you have abandoned because that little girl didn't get that support, and it's your job now to provide that support. And I felt so bad. And I went through a really intense period of grieving that I did those things, that how much I abandoned these parts of me that were desperate for that healing and nourishment and attention and compassion. And I just judged them so harshly. So that's sort of where I came when I was out of that period of threes. I was like, no, I want to reclaim these parts of me. And I went through a bit of a journey on that and learning more about things like interrelationship focusing, which is an embodied parts work method, basically, of how do you get in touch with these parts instead of trying to get rid. We don't
Yeah.
want to get rid of these things, just like all the feelings we experience. When I was in that new age kind of thinking, I thought I had to get rid of anything that was
Yes.
uncomfortable. You have to be, that kind of toxic positivity where I'm just doing the affirmations and hoping something changes. But internally, it's not like I felt safe enough to believe any of those things. I had to come to a place where, no, all of the emotions and sensations I feel are valid and serve a purpose. And it's my job to hold all of that, that none of them are right or wrong, good or bad. It just is, how do I support myself through them? And just like those different parts of me. And so that's basically the journey I've been on until today, of just really accepting those parts of myself and understanding, like, we don't have to have all the answers and turn into this wise higher self person.
Yeah.
It's like, how do we be a human right now? And
Yeah.
yeah, that's where I'm at.
Oh, I love that. And I can definitely relate to that kind of fragmentation and pushing away of the parts that, again, we think are bad or wrong, which leads to that further disconnect, right? And inner conflict. And it creates this, for me at least, this warring
Yeah.
within myself. And because I always had to be in that, like, that perfect self that, whatever we're aspiring to. And that's just not so, right? Like, we are the sum of our parts, and there are no bad parts. And I love how you said it is really about reclaiming them and coming. I always like to think like coming back home. Like, everybody's coming back home. I'm focusing on creating this place of safety so that we
Mhm.
can all be here together. And that's so amazing that you were able to. So did you study this specifically? So obviously,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I went through different kinds of trainings. So like when I was figuring out different how did the breakdown of my body occur? I realized the connection of these things. Obviously, was a therapist before I even got the treatment for Lyme disease. It's just I had been trained traditionally with talk
Yeah.
therapy and those modalities. And so really over the last, I'd say 6, 7 years is when I've hunkered down and really just, how do I dive more into, one, the biology of trauma, because there's physical supports that we need for our biology in order to really deal with processing trauma in a way that our system can handle. And then there's the emotional piece and doing the parts work and the somatic experiencing, which is just, how do we learn to bring signals of safety and support to our nervous system so that it doesn't feel like it has to be defending itself all the time.
Yes.
Um, and that's just been my mission really over the last 7 years, just to get like as much training in that as I can, but also living it myself, because really it's an intellectual experience. We can gather all the information about this stuff as possible, but until we experience it in our physiology, it's like we don't really get it or learn the same way.
Yeah.
So,
Oh,
yeah.
and it gets me so excited because I mean that there are, practitioners, therapists like you out there who are consciously choosing to do the work, right? Like
Yeah.
learning more and expanding from this. And I think, it's promising because you can tell this field is changing and there's a lot of change happening. But to come from this place where again you were traditionally trained and then you went through what you went through and you had to learn for yourself. You're like,
Yeah.
I'm learning this for me, and whatever comes out of this is great. I'll share it if I can, but I think that is really how a lot of us come to this experience. Is like no one ever, I don't think anyone chooses to do it unless they have to do it in a
Mm,
sense, right?
that's
And yeah, and it's kind of like you're thrown into it, and this is a byproduct of it. And so now, like, you share all of this, amazing information of awareness too, and building, in on social media, just from where I know you've done a lot of other talks and shares. I think it's important because a lot of us are missing that message. And you talked a little bit about like, toxic positivity
Mhm.
and, spiritual bypassing and gaslighting ourselves. And I will say that, although I do, again, I'm not a therapist, I don't proclaim to be. I did do some brain retraining programs when I first started on this journey of healing. And what has come up a lot and what I experienced, again, after going through it, is that, I mean, yes, there's a place to focus on the nervous system. It's building that safety is so, so foundational. But what happens some of the time in some of these, programs that are kind of one size fits all is that we're doing exactly what you said, pushing away the parts of us that we had, pushing aside all emotion, redirecting every sensation. We are not allowing any space to allow. And I think that that's harm. And that's one of the messages like that does harm because, what I experienced by doing that was more fear, like such suppression. My body was screaming, no longer just, talking. And I was digging, I felt like digging myself in deeper and deeper. And I see that a lot in this community we're over positive, like overdosing on the dose chemistry. I had someone the other week where I interviewed and they said, yeah, we're overdosing on the dose chemistry.
Yeah.
And it's so true. So what's your take on that and what you kind of see? Because I'm sure you see it as well in all these posts.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I know like programs like DNRS and different brain retrainings are very popular in chronic illness. And I personally, I never did DNRS. I feel like maybe I kind of probably did some of that intuitively on my own, just with visualizing and just
Yeah.
doing different things when I was in bed, and probably just doing more of that than I even realized. However, I never did a formal thing, but I do get clients who have done it. And what will happen is initially it's like there's such a fear of whatever emotion and sensation is in the body that is not pleasant or is uncomfortable, that intuitively it's like they've been learning how to disconnect. And
Yeah.
that's the issue, is that trauma lives in the disconnection between ourselves and our environment. And so we need to learn how to connect within and with our external environment in order to really reintegrate into life again and live out of survival mode. And so it is sort of just perpetuating sometimes of it's not okay to feel this. Like, and these are the things and messages we receive, particularly complex trauma survivors, childhood developmental trauma, people who have attachment trauma. We get the message when we're younger, no, you can't feel that. That's not okay. Or sometimes even punished for feeling those things. Don't cry. And it's just these messages that do so much harm and create further disconnection. And then we don't know how to feel. We don't know how to be in our bodies.
Yeah.
And that is just sort of the experience I notice for people who've only exclusively done these kinds of programs. It almost puts like a band-aid on things, and it can be a crutch, which I'm not going to knock it, because sometimes it's sort of like any antidepressants or medication, right? Like sometimes we might need something to get us through a period of time. It's like crutches while our broken leg is healing. And that's okay. I don't put any judgment on that. But at some point, if you really want to fully live life and experience being alive, you're going to have to feel all emotion and sensation.
Yes, exactly.
And not, yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, no, no.
Okay. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's like I said, I think it's a part of the puzzle. We know that visualization is helpful. We know that sometimes we don't have the capacity for the emotion yet, and we can, redirect when needed. We know that we can rewire these responses and communicate safety to our brain. So there is definitely a piece to that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're only doing that,
Yes.
right? And then, like you said, it does become a band-aid to a certain extent, because when that emotion starts to surface, and what I found is it always does in some way, especially after, you've built some safety. Let's say you started with the brain retraining and now there's some element of something. I found that after I did that, it surfaced to heal. The trauma started to surface to heal. And at that point, I was like trying to push it away, redirect, like use my tools, and my brain retraining tools weren't working.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so so what does one do at that point? From your experience?
Yeah. So the goal of the work that I at least keep in mind when I'm working with clients is just how do we slowly and gently teach the nervous system that these sensations and motions won't kill us. So every time we could dip our toe into feeling even just 10 to 30 seconds of a feeling and notice where that is in our body and how it lands, even if we could just do that, that is slowly kind of dosing the body on what it feels like to be with that and not die.
Yeah.
Basically, that's what we're doing. We have to teach the nervous system it's okay, and that these emotions that have been previously tagged as threatening, that they're not threatening and we can survive them, and we do it slowly. It's
Yeah.
not something like when I work with people, we're diving into their deepest traumas and talking about all that stuff right away. No way. First, we're just noticing what your capacity is, and then slowly as things come up, can we be with that? And then if it's too much, we just reorient and go back into something that feels a little safer. But just that kind of exercising the nervous system into feeling these things makes it more capable and widening our capacity to handle it later, so that if we could stay with it 30 seconds this time, maybe next week we'll stay with it 50 seconds, and then maybe it's a minute I can spend with that emotion. And slowly, as you're sitting with it, you expand your capacity and you can be with it longer, and then eventually you stop labeling it as bad, and you allow it as they come in real time, can experience those emotions and allow them to kind of have that peak. And then, we go through that cycle of deactivation. Like naturally, that's the rhythm of the nervous system, is we go through these cycles of expansion and contraction. We have to activate, we deactivate, and can we allow these cycles to naturally complete without interrupting them?
Mm,
That's
good.
really what life is.
Yeah, I love how you explain. It sounds, again, very simple when you think about
Yeah.
it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
organic, I guess you can say, right? Not getting in the way of it. But like you said, it's like this very incremental, like titration, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like dipping in. That's really how I started with grief as well. Like,
Yeah.
after I lost my father. I mean, I had grief from the chronic illness journey for sure, but I never really dealt with it until I had the loss of my father.
Yeah.
And then I was like, it almost said like, oh, this is real grief. Like you're
Mm-hmm.
allowed to go here. But even then I was like, I don't know how.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really about starting to create a space for a container. I didn't have a container for it. I had
Yeah.
completely shut off and in a slow and titrated way. And it took me a while. And I know you're a somatic experiencing practitioner as well. That was actually one of the supports I seeked out after my father died because there was no way I could do talk therapy around it or even relive it because it was a
Mm-hmm.
traumatic loss. And so it was here. So I'm like, well, what if I can start to feel a sense of safety here and see what happens?
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know if you could talk a little bit about grief specifically, uh, even on this journey, and how we can start. I think there's a huge fear around people saying, well, if I open myself up to it, I will get swallowed whole. I hear that a lot,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it's like it's never going to stop. We feel like opening that door, it will never end. But once we learn how to move through these cycles, you naturally learn that the cycles inevitably they do pass. We have that climax, and then it comes down when we allow it, like I said before. But I think when it comes to grief, it's so interesting because I did have a lot of this training before I lost my mother. And I've had different losses before that that maybe I wasn't as prepared for. And I think naturally, just like you, I needed to titrate. And then there's also this idea of pendulation, right? Going back and forth between what feels either it's like unpleasant or uncomfortable, and then something that even if you can't connect with the pleasant, oh, we can connect
Yeah.
with something neutral. So kind of going back and forth between those, and that's like the positive and the negative, and just kind of getting that rhythm down and getting used to that rhythm. But by the time my mother passed, it was very sudden, very shocking. And what I remember is I received the phone call, and initially it's like right away my body started shaking, and I knew exactly what was happening. Though I think had it happened even just 5 years before that or a few years before that, I wouldn't know what was happening, and I just want to push through it and like, okay, gotta figure all the things out I need to figure out, right? And just kind of keep going. What do I need to do now? But I knew exactly, okay, my body is highly activated. This is a very shocking thing to hear. And I need to let my body do whatever it's doing. And so I just kind of took the time, canceled calls, and I let my body shake for hours. Hours it was doing this. And then I fortunately had my husband with me. So having that co-regulation, having him there for support was just such a blessing as well, to just allow me to process the way I needed to process. And that's just sort of the way that I navigated that. Whatever feelings or sensations and whatever my body was doing, I just let it do it. And I think that's why, yes, I have grief over my mother. Yes, I feel waves that come and go, but it's not the level, I think, of other things where I had pushed past and not let myself feel.
Yeah.
And so I feel like I've been able to understand what the difference is when, in real time, allowing yourself to process things versus things that have happened to me in the past that I bottled up and kept moving and stayed busy. Uh,
Yeah.
and so it just, you know, I made space. I let it happen. And it's not an easy thing to do when you don't know how to do that initially, which is why if you can kind of learn how to connect with your body in these titrated ways, it makes it possible for when that big thing happens. You
Yeah.
can be with it, you know what's happening. And that's also really important. Know like your body is doing things for a reason, not to judge it, just to have
Yeah.
compassion, bring in support. Okay, my body needs to do this and move through this. So yeah, I mean, that's just where I am with grief now. If I get these feelings, I don't, yeah, it happened 4 years ago. I'm still going to feel this probably forever.
Yeah.
I have to let it happen when it comes, because I know that grief lights up in the brain the same area as addiction. Like it's a craving you can't satisfy, right? You're wanting this thing you can't have, and have so much compassion for that. Oh my goodness. Like it's so hard to go through. So just having that lens of, we need to allow these things rise as they come in real time. And the more we do that, the less we'll pay for it later with kind of just getting so overwhelmed and shut down,
Yeah.
because it does pass when we let it. So
Yeah. And that's, I mean, the fact that, like you said, is had you have gone through this, years before,
yeah,
you would have handled it differently. And I think,
yeah,
there's definitely, I can definitely relate to this concept of putting it off, pushing through, and then eventually that like exploding in my face,
yeah,
as many people can do. And also just this idea of we can't, that I always say is like, we can't brain retrain away grief because
no,
it's not a misperceived threat from your limbic system. Like it's real,
yeah,
it's valid, it's an actual loss. And I really think of grieving as learning, like learning to be in this world without this person, learning to make sense of what is here, learning to be with what is here. And it takes time. And so grieving is lifelong.
yeah,
It's going to change as you change, but the grief will always be there. And I know for a fact that like having access to resources,
yeah,
knowing how to connect to a sense of support, safety within yourself, like this work, this mind body work, this, the work that we do is really setting you up to be able to handle what life brings at you. It doesn't mean you're going to be a superhero and that, everything's going to be fine and like you're going to move through, but you now have capacity, you have resources, and you can support. And there's that word again, like support yourself through whatever life brings, which kind of brings me to my next question about healing. So I know you've posted on Instagram times as well about how healing is an ongoing process. It's
Yeah.
not a destination. And I think that's something we need to discuss because I think there's a lot of people who will come and say, like, you do this program and by this time you'll be completely healed. Or, do this practice and you'll release all your trauma forever and whatever it might be. And I think that there's this misconception and also this sense of failure that people who are healing, because
Mhm.
it's an ongoing process, are feeling. They're like, oh, I haven't arrived yet. I'm not
Yeah.
100% yet. There's something wrong with me. And I would love for you to talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it comes from those parts of us that it's like needed to perform in order to receive what they like the love and the nourishment and attunement they desperately craved. And those parts of us, like I've heard other people talk about, like they integrate into you and then it's done. And I don't really agree with that. I agree. I think that they exist and our job becomes to notice. And then when they need that attunement, when they get triggered, we have that compassion for them. And so for me, I know that it can be challenging when you hear people talk about, well, I'm healed from X, Y, and Z. I'm completely healed. But in reality, even when we talk about grief, I know realistically, if there's a big loss that occurs, I'm probably going to go into a freeze at some point and I may be in survival mode again. It's not like it's going to not happen.
Yeah.
So I think it's that difference of how do we learn to view what is occurring without the judgment. And to me, that is healing. To me, that is like applying the soothing balm to that part of us that just needs to be accepted for where it is at that moment. And knowing that life is still going to bring stuff our way. And we're going to move in and out of these nervous system states. And our goal is to be able to allow that and bring in the nourishment as needed.
Yeah.
Um, and not have that judgment towards if we are in that place where maybe we're a little bit more frozen because our capacity just, there was too much that happened too
Yeah.
quickly. And
Yeah.
I just, kind of have to allow that instead of assuming that we're never going to be affected
Yeah.
by things that happen in life. It's just like, it's not like you become an expert on the nervous system and then you no longer get really activated or no longer dip into survival mode ever again. No, they exist for a reason. Like we want to have these states of our nervous system to protect us so we can get through it. So
Yeah, and
that's
that
just,
flexibility, right?
yeah,
Yeah, I
yes,
think having that flexibility to move through states, and that's what I always say, is like it's not a failure
yeah,
that you're now in this state. It means you can move through states,
exactly,
right? And so
exactly.
see it as your nervous system is doing what it's made to do.
Yeah,
How can you afford that state?
yeah,
And I will share too that I got some kind of, man, people, the things that they say when you're going through all times. But I, no longer live with chronic illness. Thankfully, I was able to do all the things to help myself come back to safety. But it doesn't mean that I'll never have a headache again. That I won't have days where I'm just like, I don't feel like I have as much capacity today, and I'm gonna now make space and cancel a client, right? Like life is stressful. After my father died, this was my point, and I experienced chronic symptoms again. I'm not going to say chronic. I experienced life again. Okay. So it was a traumatic loss coupled with COVID at the exact same, again, that's how my father passed away and had it. And it was a traumatic experience. And then when I shared, honestly, that I was like, I'm going through a hard time, like I'm feeling all these things, and my nervous system really went, I'm in survival again, basically.
yeah.
I remember not just one person, there was a few of them saying, well, I guess you didn't brain retrain hard enough, right?
Oh
Or
man.
like those comments of like, oh, you should have done more of your nervous system work, or oh, the only reason you felt that way is because you weren't really healed enough.
Oh my
And it's
goodness.
just like wild because you're like, no, it's human. Even the
Yeah.
most regulated person, okay, even the most regulated person after experiencing, a challenging situation will feel
Mhm.
something. but they don't attach a story or label to it. That's the key, right? Like you go, my whole family went through this loss with me.
Yeah.
My mom was tired. She experienced activation, but she didn't say, oh no, now I have chronic fatigue, or now I have chronic anxiety, or whatever it might be. My husband had some aches and pains that popped up. He wasn't like, oh, I have chronic pain now. We have this awareness of like, oh, I think I know what this is. Thankfully they work with me and they know what I share with them. But I think there's a lot of judgment and misinformation on here about what healing looks like. And I
Yeah.
always say is like, as long as you're breathing
Mhm.
and your heart is beating, you're going to be challenged in some way. You're going to grow in some way. You're going to learn in some way. You're going to heal in some way. And
Yep.
so it really is a lifelong process, but not from the perspective. It's like you shouldn't fear it,
Right.
right? It's this acceptance of like that's life.
Mhm.
That's life. And anyone who's selling you another picture is lying to you.
Exactly. And I noticed this a lot about when you go through your first period of chronic illness where you start to get better. I think there's some people, it's like you get kind of confident, like that's never going to happen again. I'm never going to have a
That's
symptom again.
me.
And like I think about this too with toxic mold exposure, right? Because that's also part of my journey with just constantly needing to move and running around from that and having lived in places for periods of time that were not healthy environments for me. And I've noticed, I remember thinking to myself when I was in these kind of subpar environments that I knew had toxic mold in them. And I understand what to do to nourish my system, but there's only so much. If the environment's really bad, it is still going to affect me to a certain degree where I'm just not going to have the level of energy of somebody else that's not living in that type of environment. And I would watch these people who would get out of their environments, feel better, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, mold's not a problem. Or like, this is like, it's all in your head. All of it is in your head and you're completely, it's all about how you view it. And yes, to some extent, we don't want to get hyper vigilant that every little thing and every kind of organic material or chemical is going to kill us. We also want to be mindful that if we can be in a healthier environment and can create a healthy environment for ourselves, we want that. So
Yeah. Right.
so, I mean, for me, it's like while I was living in a place that wasn't great, I made a plan of like, here are the steps I'm going to take toward creating that healthier environment for myself. I'm not just going to ignore that it's here. I'm not going to just say, I'm just going to be able to convince my brain that it's not a problem and that's that. It's like, no, I still want to take steps towards a healthier place. You still
Yeah.
want to take action towards things. It's not like it's just magically going to stop being a problem for me. I wouldn't volunteer to go live in a very toxic environment. And it's
Yes.
whether emotionally or physically, right?
Yes. Exactly.
No different. So
No.
why am I going to try and convince myself and gaslight myself that it's okay? That's like staying in an abusive relationship. I'm not going to do that.
I'm glad you brought that up because, like you
Yeah.
said, is emotionally and physically, and we can again we can implement changes, and I also think of it this way: is okay. So some people don't have the luxury to get out right away, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is to escape whatever situation they're in, whether it's emotional or physical toxicity. But what can you do there, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you're exercising this element of choice, which those of us who have a history of trauma feel like we have none.
Exactly.
Right. And so it's like even the smallest of things, like what can I choose to support myself here? Right. What can be done differently than I would have, in the past, and making small adjustments in that time with what you have in front of you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which will in time support you to make that next choice, the next decision, whatever it might be. But yeah, I think that that's like a really, that's such a valid point, right? And even from a physical perspective too, is these bodies are human, right? They're not superhuman. And they are affected by what we consume, both mentally, what we listen, what we watch on Instagram, like all of these things, that has an effect on us. And so does what we eat, what we drink. And so we can't expect to be, to have, healing happen and recovery when we're also consuming something that is really affecting us in these toxic ways, right?
Right.
And I think that's a really important thing for people to hear is yes, mind body work, somatic work, finding safety, learning to regulate your is always I feel like so foundational,
Mhm.
right? But there's other things as well. And everyone's journey is so unique. And that's why I'm always like, there's no one size fits all. There just isn't. And yes, there are things that we can all do to support ourselves, but a lot of the times it has to be unique. You know, what works for one person may not work for another. But anyhow, it's just like it's man, such a journey and the things that you see and hear on here. And again, a place of desperation, rightfully so, because people are struggling.
Yep.
But I think a lot of people are taking advantage of that in certain ways, right? And
Yeah.
I know that it angers me because I see some programs that are like $6,000 and they say, well, I promise you you're gonna heal, but there's no money back guarantee. And then these people come to me crying, saying, like saying what do I do now? And it's a perfect, bringing it back to the beginning of our conversation, practicing discernment when it comes to where you are receiving your support. I know you talk a lot about like, hey, if you have trauma, you need to work with someone who's trauma informed and trained,
Hmm.
and someone who's going to support you from that person and who knows what they're doing.
Yeah.
And looking out for these red flags, I always say, whenever anyone promises you that they're going to fix you, that's a red flag. If they put like a time limit on it and say, oh, in 6 weeks, that's a red flag. If someone, says 100% heal, that's a red flag. And I just want people to kind of notice and practice that discernment. If you're going to work with someone in this field, like Jamie, or someone who can support you with trauma, do your research. Do it from
100.
a place of, if you can, from a place of regulation, pause, come back into yourself, connect to safety, and look at it before you make that choice based on desperation.
Yeah, and I also think that like in terms of different programs and different modalities and things that like first of all, not one thing is going to work for everyone equally and something may work for you one time and then, a year later you may not find that modality helpful or it could be really harmful to someone else even though it's really great and therapeutic for another person. So we have to consider these things, but we also want to consider the state of our nervous system that we're in when we're making these choices. I
Yes.
typically think that people who are in a really deep kind of shutdown response are probably going to need more support than a self-paced program. They're not going to have the motivation or energy. And so working one-on-one might be necessary for someone who, depending on their state, and maybe someone who is a little bit more, has more energy and maybe is a little bit more activated and self-directed, can do a self-paced thing or a membership or whatever it is or group. But like really considering the state that you're in and the level of support you may need, it's going to vary depending on how much capacity you have and how much awareness you have in that moment. So you're not always stuck needing a ton of support because as you build capacity, you can do more
Yeah.
with less. And so it's very fluid. So being, understanding of that and having that in your mind when you're making these choices, because you might be setting yourself up to have disappointment that, oh, well, I bought this course and I didn't even look at it,
Yeah.
but it's because you're so overwhelmed already, right? So it's not
Yeah.
your fault necessarily.
Your fault. Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's like a really important message for people to hear too, that there's nothing wrong with them specifically. It is
Yeah.
literally the state of their nervous system that they're in at that point. And when it comes to healing as well, we do require different supports for different seasons,
Mm-hmm.
right? So like I know like for you, different points in your healing, you did different things.
Yeah.
And I'm the same way. And I don't think that our practice should be the exact same for like the rest of our lives.
No.
And it should evolve as we evolve. It should change as we change and meet the new needs that we have, right? So
Right.
I think I love that there are so many different combinations of things that you can do, whether it's some brain retraining with, somatic experiencing, working with one-to-one coaching, doing, a course, whatever it might be, just staying compassionate,
Mhm.
right? The compassion is key. And
Mhm.
the is to not judging and meeting yourself where you're at, right?
Exactly.
So key. I'm curious as to whether at this point, in your journey, do you have a particular practice that you do, or kind of like what is your day to day? I know that you're busy, the like life is crazy, the state of the world can be crazy as well. So
Yeah.
how do you support yourself during times like this, in your
Yeah. I don't necessarily have like, here's my 7 steps I have to do every day. Like, I don't put that on myself. Every day is different, but generally speaking, we moved to this area. I've worked towards, I mean, for my entire adult life, I really basically spent moving from apartment to apartment for 20 something years. And we finally had built, my husband and I built this house on 10 acres that is in nature. And for me, honestly, being able to just walk out the door and sit and look at the birds and see the hills, to me, that sets the tone for my day most of the time. And if I'm ever like overwhelmed, like I just look out my window and it's just seeing that and orienting to the little glimmers of beauty around me is so healing. And honestly, that's what I did when I lived in New York City. I would either visualize it or take myself to Central Park when I could. And I would take pictures of something that I found beautiful every day when I lived in New York. And a lot of it was like my cats that I just had on my, at the time, there were so many pictures of my cats because I was bedbound. So it was just like, I made it a point, like every day, take a picture of something beautiful. And now it's just like, sit and look at it. Just
yeah,
look at it.
yeah.
uh, and really take that in and be in the rhythm of nature, and watch like the seasons change and have this appreciation. Like we see different birds come at different times, different flowers bloom at different times. And it really just reminds me of this message of how nothing is static like that. And
Mm.
we go through these processes and sometimes we're hibernating and sometimes we have more energy. And, I think just being and living in this reminder is like everything. It's like my basic core practice is appreciating all of that.
I
And
love that.
and then just, trying to feed my body with what's nourishing and trying not to judge myself if I don't, and noticing like if I want to indulge in something, I will let myself without that guilt. And if I need rest, to rest and not feel guilty about these things, because I think we can just put so much emphasis on like if we're not doing something or we don't have a practice that we're doing at all times, then we're not healing. But
Yeah.
I just don't see it that way because so much of the healing happens when we just allow the peaks and valleys. And so sometimes that might mean not moving and some stillness, and that is just as valid. So,
Yeah,
uh,
I love that. Yeah,
yeah,
that your seat is I always say, and this has been kind of one of my mottos, proclamations, is we live as we heal and we heal as we live. Healing, doing work doesn't necessarily just mean doing all of these specific practices like
yeah,
locked up in your bedroom for an hour
yeah,
a day. I just like you, I love getting outside and noticing the world around me and seeing like, well, what if I took a walk? That the walk is a part of my healing. What if I can't walk? Well, what if going outside and sitting on the grass, this is a part of my healing? What if this breath is a part of this, right? It all really depends on your perspective of this. And you just gave a beautiful example of being bedbound,
yep,
sitting in your room, and yet choosing to look for like the glimmers, right? Choosing
yes,
to see the symbols of beauty, of
yep,
safety, and seeking that. And I think that that's something that needs to be intentional.
mhm,
And probably one of the foundational pieces of really coming back and back to life in a sense is seeking out those things, because we spend so much time seeking out the danger, seeking out what is wrong. And like that was such a golden rewiring thing that you did. Like that's DNRS basics, right?
yeah.
Like
Exactly. That's what I said. Like I unintentionally did some of it and I would watch these documentaries. Like this is the other thing is like being forced. I was forced to be bedbound, right? I could not push myself anymore. My system crashed. And it was like I had nowhere to go and nothing to do but be like within and, sit with things really, truly. And eventually coming to the place of like, okay, well, if I'm going to be sitting here, what if I put on, and I did documentaries of Greece. And I know you get to go. I see
Ah,
all your pictures of going to
yeah,
Greece,
yeah.
which I live vicariously through you. But like documentaries about Italy and like looking at the architecture and like visualizing that. And I remember, I think I've told this story before on my stories on Instagram, but when this movie Kill Bill, where
Yeah.
um, there's that scene with Uma Thurman where she's coming out of the coma and learning how to like move her body again, and she's willing herself to wiggle her toes, and like watching that, I had the epiphany that, oh, just this little bit of movement is all that matters to start bringing energy and connection to my body again. And that's what I did for exercise, was pumping my feet and wiggling my toes, if that's all I could do, and eventually lifting my head off the pillow. And these little movements lead to the bigger flow that you have when you can be fully mobilized. But it's that starts with those micro movements, those micro glimmers. And just that little bit of connecting back to the life within yourself and around you sets the tone to get you kind of it keeps the healing going. And that's what really, like, you come back to life, really. You're just becoming alive again.
That's literally what it feels like, right?
Yeah.
It's literally coming back to life. And I would say experiencing life differently. Um,
Mm-hmm.
in comparison to the life you were living prior to this, I don't know if you can relate, is I see things and experience things way different than
Yeah.
I did prior to, my perfect storm. It feels more alive.
Mm-hmm.
I feel more connected to people, to things. It feels more vibrant, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just
Yeah.
wild.
And
Yeah.
just authentic. Like, it just
Yeah.
feels like, just give me it all. Like, I don't care if it feels bad. I want it to. I want to be able to witness whatever is going on around me. So, because the level to which we go, the depths within ourselves, will be able to hold space for other people. And you just experience the world and its richness so much more fully. And I think it's just having that authenticity with yourself and others, just letting people be who they are, letting yourself be where you are. It's a beautiful thing.
It is. And so, what would you say to someone who thinks that they've experienced so much in their life and that they are too far gone? Like there is no hope for them. They have complex PTSD, maybe they have chronic illness. Um, is there a hope rope that you could give them? What would you say to someone who feels like they are the exception to any rule and that nothing can help them?
I would say, like, I totally get you because I can't tell you how many times I said to myself, is this forever? Like every time I had a symptom, anytime I was really feeling completely immobilized, like, because that's what happens. The state of your nervous system determines the state of your mind.
Yeah.
And so if we're shut down and we're immobilized because we have to conserve our energy because we're healing and we're going through something, we have little capacity. Our thoughts are going to go to that place that this is forever. We are stuck, because that's sort of everything has just slowed down and become shut down.
Yeah.
And that makes perfect sense. So I first want to validate that, like, I get that. I totally get
Yeah.
that. And then that's why I say, how do we, in terms of slowly building connection with ourselves again, that micro movement? And that's where, whatever way possible, I think for somebody in that experience, if you can even just connect with a past experience or remember a time that brings a different sensation to your biology, in just that moment, you will feel it, because that's what happens. And I know this is a lot of the work that you do with using visualization. And that's why those tools can be so powerful in moments where it can be that little micro movement towards, wait a minute, I'm feeling something different in my physiology. Maybe I'm not stuck, because even if it only lasted for 10 seconds, I
Yes.
got a glimmer of a different emotion and sensation. And that just shows you you're not stuck. You're
Yeah.
not stuck.
Oh, I love that. I hope people are write that one down because I would say I get people saying, it only lasted 5 seconds or it only lasted 10 seconds. And I'm like, yeah, but you felt it.
Yep.
Like you got there. You're not stuck. That's proof, that's evidence that you can move through states. That's
Yep.
evidence of flexibility. It's evidence of change, even if
Yep.
it's momentary. And I think, like you said, is I'm assuming you were consistent. Like you said, is like, I'm gonna wiggle my toes today. I'm gonna keep
Mhm.
wiggling my toes. I'm gonna lift my head up. I'm gonna take a step, show up in some way every day with that vision in mind, right? Of being able to move again and resourcing with a past memory of that experience. And I love that you were just, again, using visuals, like
Yeah.
watching, documentaries in Greece to say like, well, maybe
Yep.
one day I'm going to we should meet up there one day, Jamie.
I know, that would be amazing. But
Yeah.
also, like, that's the other thing is we might need to borrow from someone else's nervous system too. If we're really feeling that stuck, and that's where getting support and why I say if we're in that place, doing a self-paced course is probably not going to be the answer for you. You're going to maybe need to borrow that someone's nervous system who can help guide you for that co-regulation and
Yeah.
also to help just normalize that these are totally understandable feelings and thoughts to have. It makes perfect sense when you've been surviving so long. So just validating that I think is so important and understanding you're not alone in thinking that and it just makes perfect sense.
Yes, and I think that that was such a hope rope for people listening. I know I'll get quite a few DMs on that exactly.
Yeah.
So I know that you have a few offerings, and before we close, I really wanted to give you the opportunity to share, how you help others and how they can reach out to you.
Yeah. So I have just sort of like a little mini course, the Nervous System 101, that just goes into basics of understanding the different states of your nervous system, how you can start working with that flow and going back and forth between states. And then I have one-on-one coaching that I do with people. So I did used to do a group program that I've been called the Nervous System Reset that's been on pause, a little bit more involved. And I think for a lot of the clients that I tend to attract, which tend to be experiencing some severe chronic illnesses, they do need a little bit more handholding and support directly and going just, at their pace slowly, as opposed to dripping out content that can be very overwhelming sometimes and information heavy. So I really just love being there to help guide people into that experience for themselves in being in their body because it's just such a rewarding and beautiful thing to see people, like you said before, coming back to life. It's just, there's nothing better than that. So,
Yeah, it is. It is an absolute gift, right?
yeah,
To be able to witness that, to witness them in their pain and their struggle, to hold that space, and to also witness that transformation, right,
yes.
happening before your eyes. Because I think that there's something so beautiful that happens in these relationships of co-regulation and in these one-to-one experiences where you can't necessarily get through like a studies course, right? And I think that that's why some people, and it doesn't have to be everyone, but for some people, yeah, I think that that's what makes it, right? That's the safety they've been needing. They need to be witnessed,
Mhm.
validated, sat with, like maybe they never had anyone sit with them before.
Yeah,
And this concept of, well, maybe I don't have to do it alone.
yeah,
So yeah, so for anyone who's struggling out there as well, reach out for support. Jamie, anyone other, so many of us in the community, but I know Jamie is so unique. And I absolutely love everything you share. And I'm so grateful you could join today and just give us a glimpse into your beautiful mind and your journey of, transformation, right? This
yeah.
ongoing thing, but it is a transformation. You're never the same person you were when you joined in. And thank you for allowing me to also just witness your grief today as well and hear a little bit about your story about your mom as well. And yeah, it's such an honor.
Mhm.
I know how it feels. And thank you for taking time to be vulnerable and share with us today.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I just appreciate all that you do. So I'm just so grateful to be here with you. So just thank
Uh,
you. Thank you for everything.
Thank you, Jamie.